Today, I am breaking down one of the most misunderstood training zones in all of running, the sub-threshold run. I'll show you exactly what it is, why it's insanely effective for marathon performance, and how to find your precise sub-threshold zone so that you're not just guessing effort. We're gonna cover how to progress these runs week to week, why they are not the same as marathon pace, and why sub-threshold training became the backbone of some world-class training systems. Sub-threshold workouts helped me go from 310 to 240 in the marathon without getting injured, burning out, and actually enjoying the training. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to use sub-threshold running to not only get faster, but to stay healthy for the years to come. Before we talk about what sub-threshold is, we have to define what threshold running is. Threshold is the fastest effort that you can hold while still clearing lactate as quickly as you're producing it. Running any faster than threshold, lactate starts to build up, your breathing will spike, and your fatigue will start to snowball. Most well-trained runners can hold threshold effort for about 60 minutes of racing. So what makes a sub-threshold run different from a threshold run? Sub-threshold training is running comfortably hard, fast enough to challenge your aerobic system, but still controlled enough that you're not building up fatigue or lactate. So put simply, it's the hardest effort that you can run while still staying fully aerobic. And what is aerobic running, you might ask? Aerobic running is any effort you can sustain while your body is effectively using oxygen to produce energy. To train at a proper sub-threshold effort, you need to have some sort of aerobic foundation. An aerobic foundation or an aerobic base is the long-term fitness you build up from a lot of this easy and steady controlled running. It's essentially your body's energy system that allows you to run farther, stay healthy, and handle the harder training without breaking down or getting injured. I have a full breakdown on aerobic training. I'll link it up here. Highly encourage you to have an aerobic foundation and have an understanding of what that means before getting into these sub-threshold runs. Otherwise, it won't make total sense, and you'll see why later. In order to really dig deep on this sub-threshold training, we kind of have to know where it all started from. So let's flash back a little bit to the 1950s and 60s. Came Arthur Lydiard. So he created a training system built on these steady, controlled, longer runs that stress the aerobic system without the exhaustion. That is exactly what we now call sub-threshold training. Lydiard's motto for all of his athletes back in this time was train, don't strain. Obviously, they didn't have heart rate monitors, they didn't have lactate testing. He had all of his athletes run based on feel, staying relaxed, controlling their breathing. He taught them if you strain, you ruin the workout. If you stay controlled, you build fitness. So without any modern tools, they really had to lean into how their legs were feeling and whether or not the pace actually felt sustainable for the workout. Now, the first of Arthur Lydiard's athletes to really put this into practice were Barry McGee and Jeff Julian. They both ran 2:14 in the marathon, with Barry McGee actually medaling at the Olympics. They both were running between 100 and 140 miles per week, with these 10 to 15 mile sub-threshold efforts mixed in. Now, modern sports science later confirmed that training in this zone built mitochondrial density, increased capillary reach, improved aerobic power, and created that durable marathon fitness that they were looking for. Now, the reason I say this kind of training is gold for marathoners is because this is the exact effort you use to run a marathon. So you're practicing that effort. It's not about the pace, not about the heart rate, although those are tools that we can use. They're very different. How do you know what sub-threshold training is for you? It's my contention that it's still best to use effort. I mean, people call it RPE, rate of perceived exertion, running based on feel. For now, we're just gonna call it effort. When we're talking about running based on effort, most people think of it on a scale of 1 to 10 or percentages. Let's talk based on percentages now, and we'll go from 0 to 100. There's two other tools that people commonly use to gauge their effort, and that is going to be heart rate and pace. 0% effort would be while you're at rest. So for your heart rate, that would be your resting heart rate. We're going to use my resting heart rate as an example today. So 45 beats per minute corresponds to 0% effort, and obviously no pace because we're not moving. And let's go up to the top. Let's go to 100%. 100% effort, that's gonna correspond with your max heart rate. For me, that's 195. Now let's hop over to pace. That's where things get a little tricky because what is your max pace? What is your 100% effort pace? Well, what is pace? And here in the US, it's minutes per mile. Somewhere else in the world, it could be minutes per kilometer, but it's highly dependent on the distance you're going. You might say, oh, well, my max pace is my sprint, but when you say that an all-out mile or 5K, you're also performing at your max effort. Well, then therefore, your 100% effort can be a variety of different paces. And that's where things start to get a little confusing. So let's swing back to effort. As we start going up the chart, you could say 10% effort is a leisurely walk in the park. Once you get up to 40, 50%, this might be an easy jog. 85%, that is gonna be roughly your threshold. To find your corresponding threshold heart rate, you're gonna wanna actually use what's called your heart rate reserve. What your heart rate reserve is your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate. So the full bandwidth of your heart times 85%. And then you have to add back on your resting heart rate because that is your baseline so long as you are still alive. I have a full breakdown on heart rate reserve, calculating your aerobic zone in my aerobic base video. 85% effort or 85% of my heart rate reserve is around 174 beats per minute. Now, what is my corresponding threshold pace? You know, you're reading someone like Jack Daniels, their workouts are gonna be based on tempo or threshold pace. Now, we talked about how distance is the main factor when it comes to pace. There's also a ton of external factors that can affect pace that are not talked about nearly enough. I believe pace is the least reliable way to judge intensity when it comes to running because it can be affected by hills, wind, humidity, the shoes you're wearing, your fatigue levels, how fueled up are you? Like the list goes on and on. There's a time and place where hitting specific paces is very important. But when we're talking about marathon pace, we're talking about a lot of cumulative miles over the course of a build. And if you're consistently chasing certain paces, it can really lead you to some disastrous results. Maybe you can get away with it here and there. It's not really sustainable long term. Whether it's your goal pace, your predicted pace, your previous marathon pace, any of these paces can just be affected by way too many factors. It's also just not that fun to train that way. If you're constantly seeing whether or not your watch buzzes and you hit your mile on time, opposed to just being in tune with your body, really like wondering, like, can I hold this for 26 miles? That's what you should be honing into for these runs. Now let's jump back to heart rate. Heart rate definitely has factors that can impact it, and that could be, you know, your levels of hydration, stress, sleep, time of day that you're running. A lot of these things also do impact your heart rate. It's still a message that's coming from inside. It's a like internal dashboard telling you how much energy you are exerting to maintain the exercise. And when it comes to effort, I believe there to be mainly one factor that impacts what you believe your running effort to be, and that is your experience with running. How long have you been running for? If you're brand new to running, pretty much everything feels like almost 100% effort because you don't have that aerobic foundation. And we can show this in a lab where someone who is new to running, their aerobic zone very small compared to someone who has trained for a while. Your aerobic zone actually expands, therefore delaying that point where you cross over into threshold. So if you're brand new to running, that's why I say you have to establish an aerobic foundation or a base before you get into this sub-threshold training, because everything is just gonna feel difficult. When someone has 10, 15 plus years of training and racing at a high level, they're really gonna know their limits. They're gonna know before they start tipping into that point where they're pushing too hard in a workout. Why does this really matter for threshold and sub-threshold training? Well, your sub-threshold training is gonna happen at about 75 to 80% effort. So while it is close to that 85, it's still considerably lower. Now for me specifically, when we're looking at my heart rate, it's about 9 to 16 beats per minute lower than what my threshold heart rate would be. Again, you can do all of this without testing lactate, just by running based on feel, but heart rate is a good tool to use. How is subthreshold running different from marathon pace? Training with marathon pace is a little tricky because let's say early in the build, you're still 3-4 months out, following a training plan online and it has you at 10 miles at marathon pace. Well, you're on some rolling hills, you're not rested up, you're not tapered up, you're in the middle of your training. Forcing that pace could actually put you into threshold training too early in the build. And why this is important for marathon running is because very little of the marathon is actually raced at threshold pace or effort. Like we talked about earlier, threshold is about the effort that you can hold for an hour-long race. Marathon is 2, 3, 4 times that length. Too many of these marathon pace runs, you can start to build up a lot of acid in your system. The lactate itself isn't inherently bad. Your body can recycle it and use it for energy, but if you're using a lot of it, there's an acid byproduct that's produced. If you get too much of that acid built up in your system, it can essentially reverse a lot of these positive adaptations that we were talking about, like with the mitochondria, the capillaries. A lot of these positive adaptations that are happening can essentially be halted by too much acid in your system. It could take multiple days to recover from, depending on your experience, and potentially set you up for injury, burnout, or peaking too early before the race. Because training at threshold and above is such a higher intensity and involves your anaerobic energy system, that system can actually be brought up to speed in a couple weeks. Now let's get into exactly how to implement these into your training. Again, if you're just getting into running, you need to establish that foundation. We've already covered this. If you're a bit more experienced, this is gonna take some trial and error. It's gonna take practice, just like anything. But you can use your heart rate as a guide. Calculate your heart rate reserve, try to work in some efforts and some paces to where you're comfortably hard, but you feel like you can sustain it. The longest you want to do these in training is an hour. So I know we talked about how threshold running is the pace that you can hold in a race for an hour. Subthreshold running is the effort you want to hold for an hour in training. So much different. In training, you don't have the race day adrenaline, you're not tapered up, you're not always carb loaded or super well rested, much different. An hour consecutive at the subthreshold effort is what you want to work up to. Do you need to instantly jump into that? No, of course not. I typically, in the beginning of my build, will like to start out with like some fartlek speed play intervals in this regard. 5 minutes on at the subthreshold effort with a couple minute rest. 5 minutes back on, couple minute rest. Eventually you can work up to like 20, 30 minutes consecutively. Once those mitochondria really kick in and your aerobic energy is flowing, you can hit these for an hour very comfortably, and they're super fun. They're my favorite kind of training. And you can see your time progress across the build. Lydiard, a lot of his athletes would start out, they would do about 10 miles and it would take them about 65 minutes at this subthreshold effort to finish it. By the end of the build, they were like low 50s, covering the same amount of ground at the same effort. That's when they knew they were ready to race. They were running like low 5-minute pace at these subthreshold efforts. They were ready for some 2:14 marathons. The most you want to do these is twice a week. Now, here's an example week of what a athlete training under the Lydiard system may have followed. Subthreshold runs on Monday and Friday. The Monday session being a little less intense than the Friday because Sunday you had typically a 22 or a 20 plus mile long run. Wednesday would be a mixed fartlek, so there would be some subthreshold efforts, some sprints to maintain some leg speed that were all kept under 10 seconds to avoid any lactic acid. So you can see all of this running was aerobic. This was done around the year, but mainly during the aerobic base period before higher heart rate training was introduced. So Lydiard followed this periodized training. There wasn't threshold or VO2 max work to be done all the time. Lydiard understood that there was a time and a place for that, and it was typically closer to the race day. Once you were sharpening up, reducing the mileage, and getting the athlete ready to peak on race day, as opposed to staying in tip-top shape around the year, because he realized how hard that is to do, how hard that is on the body to always be in really, really good shape. So a lot of Lydiard's athletes avoided racing too much. They would just stick to maybe 1 or 2 race cycles per year and just focus on being at the best shape they could be in when that day came. I want to show an example of a subthreshold run that I did leading into my Chicago Marathon this year. I'm not really worried about my pace. I am keeping an eye on my heart rate just to make sure I'm not pushing too hard. There was some points where I got into like 167, 168 range. This was about a month before Chicago, so I was okay hitting a little bit of a higher heart rate. Now I want to show you my heart rate data from the actual Chicago Marathon. A bit too conservative in the beginning of the race. I should have been pushing a little bit of a higher heart rate, but I was, again, running mainly based on feel and just making sure that I ran the race strong. So I definitely saved some energy for the back half, but I want to show this to you because a subthreshold run is essentially practicing like the first hour of the marathon. It's a very similar effort. Obviously in the marathon, you will be rested up, you'll be tapered, carb fueled, carbon plates on, pace will be on your side during the race day. Now in the back half of Chicago, you can see my heart rate does get above my threshold heart rate. So you do have to do some training at threshold. Absolutely, no doubt about that. I got this strategy from Keith Livingstone here in Healthy Intelligent Training. He talks about how in the last month leading up to a marathon, you swap out 2 of your subthreshold runs with threshold runs. So instead of an hour long at subthreshold, you can do, a 20-minute warm-up followed by 20 minutes at threshold effort with a 20-minute cool down. Now, what this is going to simulate is the back half of the marathon when you're pushing hard. You might not necessarily be at threshold pace, right? Because you're trying to hold on to that marathon pace, but your effort and your heart rate will certainly be at that threshold level. So you do have to have some training so that your body is used to that feeling, but you just don't have to overdo it. A couple of these sessions mixed in with a couple VO2 max right as you're starting to taper up for the race is really all you need. Any more than that, and according to Keith, you're just risking like blowing the doors off your training. You have to make sure that those proper energy systems are in place so that whenever you show up to race day, you're not showing up flat, you're not burned out, you're not injured. Most of this marathon training is just staying healthy. So that's the point of these workouts. Like obviously you could be nailing threshold workouts, keeping your lactate super dialed in, testing everything, really riding the edge of injury the whole time. You maybe got in really good shape, but then you couldn't maintain it. And then you showed up to race day flat, burned out, or injured. And this happens to a ton of people. If you've been in the running world long enough, you see this happen all the time. And it's because, in my opinion, chasing paces over listening to your body or your heart rate. So yes, are there quicker ways to get faster or to maximize your fitness? Sure, of course. If you're racing some of these shorter distances like the mile, 2 mile, 5K, you're gonna have to be very comfortable with running above threshold. This is such a perfect way to train. Why doesn't everyone do this? Because it's more of a long-term approach. The aerobic system, like we talked about, takes years and years to develop. So this is a way of training and expanding your aerobic zone in a highly effective, but also just a highly conservative way. This is a way to continue to progress in a linear fashion, as opposed to going up and down, battling injuries, showing up to the start line beat up. Why don't we see elite runners do this? What did we talk about is the most important aspect when it comes to running, and that is running based on feel, and that is directly determined by your experience. People might look at Connor Mance or Clayton Young's Strava. Maybe you watch Clayton Young's YouTube videos where you see them always chasing paces and trying to hit, an exact mile rep at a certain time. You have to consider Connor Mance ran his first half marathon when he was 12 years old. He just set the American record, now at 28 years old, pro for 5+ years. Same with Clayton. They've been at this for a long time. They're very highly in tune with their body. They know what they're capable of. They're here trying to shave seconds off their marathon time. So that's why they're more so chasing the paces. I would also argue that they would benefit from training like this. I think it is worth noting that at the time of making this video, they both are injured and missing their races they had planned. Running at threshold and running at these higher speeds is a bit like playing with fire. It's very powerful, it's explosive, but if you play with fire long enough, you're bound to get burned here and there. These guys have been in the game for a long time, and they're out here literally breaking records. It's a bit of a different game, but for the average middle of the pack runner, we're just trying to progress, stay healthy, and stay in the game. I believe subthreshold is the way to do it. Even if you're not just training for a marathon, these subthreshold runs can be used at any point during your training cycle because they are completely aerobic. You're not risking building up too much acid. They're just gonna continue to expand your aerobic capacity. And that's what the majority of these races really rely on, where the marathon is actually 99% based on your aerobic capacity. There is, again, a little bit of that anaerobic threshold work that comes into play in the home stretch, but it's really about how long can you hold these harder efforts and stay healthy while doing it. What do you guys think? Have you ever tried subthreshold running? If you have, let me know what you think. Is it the hidden gem of training and running? Is it something that's really overlooked, or do you think it kind of got left in the past for a reason? Catch you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Peace.